Actually, one of the first things that I can remember was probably the day after Pearl Harbor Day. My mother and my grandmother lived with us at this time, and they were standing in a big bay window talking about the fact that Roosevelt had asked Congress to declare war because of the bombing the day before. My grandmother had recently returned from a trip to New York City, had visited some relatives out there, and she'd bought a little figurine probably about 4 or 5 inches high of the Statue of Liberty. And they looked at that thing, and underneath it was marked Made in Japan. And of course, there was such bad feeling about the Japanese. My mother and grandmother spent the next hour at the sink scouring off that Made in Japan. They didn't want to throw the figurine away, but they didn't want anything in the house that was made in Japan.
During World War II, in Lena and all over the United States, rationing was required by law. Meat was required to be rationed by citizens because a majority of the meat was sent to the troops. Citizens were able to purchase meat if they had a ration coin specifically meant for meat, but even when they were able to purchase meat, they were never given a lot. But during World War II, Spam was not rationed, so it was widely used as a substitute for meat in recipes. Citizens were encouraged to grow vegetables for the soldiers overseas, what came to be known as victory gardens. Along with the rationing on meat, gasoline was also rationed in America. Citizens could only purchase gas if they had a certain stamp. The stamp identified how much gas a person could get per week. There were 8 different types of stamps that were issued, depending on your social ranking. The 8 different stamps were labeled A, B, C, D, E, R, T, T, and X. The general population was issued A stamps, and they were eligible to get 4 gallons of gas per week. B stamps were issued to those essential for the war effort, and they were eligible for 8 gallons of gas per week. C stamps were issued to ministers, doctors, and other important citizens. They were eligible to get as much gas as they needed. TT stamps were issued to approved commercial trucks, and they were eligible for 5 gallons of gas per week. And X stamps were only issued to congressmen, and they did not have a limit on how much gas they were allowed to get. Robert's father was issued B stamps because he worked in the defense plant during the war. Along with the rations on gasoline and meat, there was also rationing on sugar. There was rationing on sugar because most of it was being shipped to the troops overseas. The rationing on sugar was a big deal because many Americans during the time canned a lot of their food, and sugar is a main ingredient when it comes to canning. So, because of the rationing on sugar, many Americans had to find different techniques to can their food.
Gasoline and tires were rationed. They had gas stamps, and you had a little sticker that you'd put in the windshield of your car. And they, as I recall, they issued either A, B, or C stamps, and the stamps had to match the sticker. If you had an A stamp, you got practically no gas. If you had a B stamp, that meant you were a computer. That was what my dad had. C stamps were for commercial trucks and utilities and ambulances and that type of thing. What I can remember people talking about is in the cities they were growing tomatoes in flower boxes and that type of thing. It was probably different in there. It was pretty rural where I lived. Normal things, radishes, carrots, lots of tomatoes, potatoes. We had a little sweet corn and beans. We had a pretty good sized garden. It was probably 50-foot square. I never liked gardening. I don't raise one to this day. Meat was rationed, and we'd have to go to that little town. We'd go to City Hall. My mother would go to City Hall once a month and pick up those little red meat tokens, and we didn't. And they were pretty tight with them. You didn't get a lot of meat. But one of the things that I remember is that Spam was not rationed, a canned Spam. And my mother got quite creative with fixing that because we'd have Spam 2 or 3 times a week. We didn't have enough meat. Well, everybody grumbled about it, but no, it was just, we took it in stride. We had food. And there were other things that were a lot more important, like, getting the war over with. One of my mother's favorite things would be to take the Spam, cut up in slices, and just dice it into little squares, and then put that in a frying pan along with some potatoes and eggs, and just make a hash out of it. That was dinner a couple of times a week. Actually, well, I don't remember it being that bad. However, the old saying is, when you're hungry, you can eat most anything. I haven't had any Spam since then, though. One of the things I remember during that period of time is, even Lena was a small town, but it was close enough to Rockford, and Rockford being that time the largest nut and bolt fastener city in the world, probably, at least the United States. There was some concern about air raids. If they'd bomb Rockford or have an air raid, they would get that. They're only 50 miles away, and so we had blackouts periodically, maybe once a month. I'm not sure just how often, but there'd be a night we'd have to be told to stay in the house, keep all the lights off. We had block captains that would go around. If they saw anybody with a light on, they'd knock on the door and ask you to turn it off.
In 1941, the U.S. Office of Civilian Defense was responsible for coordinating preparations for wartime emergencies. The first measure implemented by the U.S. Office of Civilian Defense to protect the U.S. from air raids was having planes flying along the coasts and having manned towers along the coasts on the lookout for enemy planes. Another precaution established by the U.S. Office of Civilian Defense was air raid drills. During an air raid drill, a siren would sound alarming the city of an oncoming air raid, and everyone would be required to shut off any source of light. As a child, Robert remembers seeing the wardens patrolling the streets during air raid drills.
One of my fears was that my dad would get drafted. It never happened, but of course I was concerned that he would, and would maybe not return home. He was born in 1909, so 35, he's almost 30 years old when I was born, so yes, early 30s. He had to register, but he was never drafted. I don't think he particularly wanted to be, no. Concerned, yeah, he probably was. Everybody, from what I was told, under 50, between the ages of 18 and 50, had to register. And I did later on, when I came to Rockford and started working, ran into a couple of guys who were single at the time, and they were in their late 40s and did get drafted. And we were all pretty much afraid of Hitler. We thought he was going to come marching down the street at any time, although he was probably never close to Lena, but that was the fear in those days. At least it wasn't the small kids in the neighborhood. I don't think anybody was trembling, scaring, but it was the thought that you had with you all the time, and all in the back of your mind. You went on through your daily routine and play and so forth, but that threat, I felt, was always there, and I think the other kids my age did too. I was raised over in western Stevenson County, a town of Lena. It was about 1,200 people at that time. It's about 3,600 now. My father was a small electrical contractor in Lena, and shortly after that, sometime in 1942, he closed his business. There just was not any electrical materials, and there wasn't much work in those small towns, and he just pretty much starved him out. First job he took after that was in Freeport. There was an old engine company, a Stover engine company, that had been bought up pretty much by the government and handed to Fairbanks Morris. And they were making a defense plant out of it. He worked for that contractor until that job was done, and then he went to work for Fairbanks in the defense plant as a maintenance electrician. One of the other things I can remember, and this was probably after Dad was working first shift and was home evenings, one of the prominent radio news broadcasters at that time was Gabriel Heater. And he'd always start out with, his opening phrase would be, "Ah yes, ladies and gentlemen, there's good news or there's bad news tonight." And my dad was so interested in what was going on, he'd make me be totally quiet, couldn't play with anything and just sit on the floor during Gabriel Heater's news broadcast. And I was not a particular fan of Gabriel Heater at that time. Another thing I remember is Roosevelt's fireside chats. Dad rarely missed one of those.
During World War II, many Americans, including Robert's father, listened to President Roosevelt's fireside chats. Despite the name, Roosevelt's fireside chats did not take place by a fire. Instead, Roosevelt stood at a desk in his office surrounded by microphones and spoke to the American people. Roosevelt's fireside chats were intended to make the American people feel secure. He used a very informal and conversational tone while speaking. And he used this simplistic style of speaking to include all of the American people in his speeches because he wanted to get his point across to everybody. He urged the American people to face the difficulties in their lives with patience and understanding.
Now, one time near the end of the war, I don't remember just exactly when that would be, but there was a tornado that went through just a little bit northeast of Lee in another much smaller town called McConnell, and it flattened several farms and a good deal of that little bit of a town. And they sent German prisoners in from Camp Grant here in Rockford to clean that up, and they came through in Army stakes trucks. There was 2 soldiers in the front with, you could see their rifles sticking up, and there'd be 2 soldiers in the back of the truck with the rifles pointed down, and weren't going to let anybody escape. And I assume they got them out there and cleaned up the junk, and then they'd go past our house at night and they camped somewhere. I don't think they could have sent them all the way back to Rockford. That went on for about a week. I remember 5 or 6 days that you see them go out in the morning and come back at night with those truckloads of German prisoners. I was glad they were in the truck. And we assumed Hitler was probably not among them. World War II was more of a threat to us as a country, as being invaded and taken over. The other 2 wars were smaller, and they were, of course, none of the wars were here, but I don't think anybody ever felt that we were actually going to lose our country and become subjects of somebody else because of them. They were being fought for political reasons, and more so than, to me, World War II was a fight for survival. We had ships and submarines on both coasts, not far away. When we fought World War II, we tried to win, and that was every possible thing we could possibly do. There's politics in every war, but the wars that followed, it became more political than fighting, and it acted like the government didn't want us to win. But there were lines you couldn't go across, and you couldn't do this, and you couldn't do that. To me, if you're going to fight a war, you pull out the stops and you just bomb the hell out of everybody until you win. Well, it was an all-out effort to reach a common goal. Everybody sacrificing, pitching in and doing more than your share, and just get it done.
When I first entered the Harlem Vet Doc program, I was in a very dark place in my life. Horrible events happened over the summer, which made it so I lost my motivation and my drive. But when I first started the program, things changed. The Vet Doc program gave me a cause, it gave me a purpose, made it so that I felt I had to strive to get something done. Made it so that I felt like I was needed. Granted, it is an extremely hard class. Almost everybody fell behind at one point or another, and you have to work extremely hard to get back up to pace. And that's why the teachers are very handy. Mr. Stange and Mr. Johnson are very good at what they do, which is making sure you get your stuff done. And that's why they put a lot of stress on you so that you get it done. But the stress is needed. If I didn't have stress, I wouldn't have gotten stuff done. And I like that they put stress on you because it means they actually care about your work. It means they're actually hoping that you bring something great out of what you make. Hoping that your documentary is as great as you think it is. And I'm really glad that I chose the Vet Doc program.